Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 17 waiver wire targets for the 2022 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, we're going to be talking about prospects at the running back, wide receiver, tight end, quarterback, kicker, and defensive positions going into Week 17. Again, if you're watching today's video, congratulations. You have made it through the entire marathon of the season. We are in the final stretch in order to try to help you capture a 2022 fantasy football championship. Of course, the players that I mentioned on today's episode are hopefully going to help you out if in fact you need them. In many of our scenarios, we're going to be sitting there playing our studs going into this given week, but for many of us who experience some of the inconsistencies of play from our studs, guys like Stephon Diggs, Devontae Adams, DeAndre Hopkins didn't even show up. There's a lot of circumstances in which we may need the potential values of said players that we mentioned to go ahead, help our teams, and capture that 2022 fantasy football championship. Again, like I've mentioned throughout the entirety of the season, this has been a marathon, and we are finally here with a lot of tough decisions that we've made, of course, with the struggles of dealing with injuries and inconsistencies of play, and of course, for many of us, having very lucky weeks to get into this current position, so congratulations. Now, as I go throughout today's video, we're going to be mentioning players that are typically rostered in less than 50% of Yahoo leagues. Again, with the higher availability, you can go ahead and potentially pick these players up, whether it is in one of the volume positions, to help you guys out within the given week. Do not forget, we're making fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2022 season, even up until next week. I know many of you have been trapped in Week 18 championships because your commissioners did not change the settings. I'll still be here to help you guys out, and even beyond that, going into the NFL playoffs. Now, for those of you who are currently in limbo and don't know the results as to whether or not you've advanced to your Week 17 championship, that mainly has to do with tonight's game between the Indianapolis Colts and Los Angeles Chargers. I'll go ahead and put a candle down in the comment section just to go ahead and pray to the fantasy gods that we can all clutch it up and advance to the next round. While you're down in the comment section, whether you're asking a question, anything of that nature, click on the like button down below. Greatly appreciate that. Be sure to go ahead and check out PrizePicks. There's a link down in the description. We're going to go ahead and put together a potential entry for tonight's Monday Night Football game at the end of today's episode. If you guys check out the link in the description, use promo code Andrew today when you sign up and make that first time deposit. Your first time deposit is immediately doubled up to $100. So go ahead, check that out today. Thank you very much. All right, let's talk about Week 17 running back targets. Like I mentioned, I primarily want to focus on players that are rostered in less than 50% of leagues. So two of the players that may be available in your league, perhaps, that I'm not going to be mentioning at a greater capacity is Tyler Allgeier and James Cook, two running backs that had themselves great weeks in Week 16. Yet again, 49% rostered on Yahoo for Tyler Allgeier and 52% for James Cook. Both these guys we've mentioned ad nauseum over the course of the last couple weeks here. We should absolutely have already had them on roster. These are guys that we're not going to mention, and of course, if they are available, should be picked up. Now let's talk about the official number one running back that we've already talked about in the same circumstance at a higher rate, similar to a Tyler Allgeier and James Cook, yet he's currently only rostered in 38% of leagues at this current moment in time. Now, the reason why we want to mention Chuba Hubbard is because he's coming off a pretty good week of 12 carries for 125 rushing yards against the Detroit Lions defense, has the privilege of taking on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in Week 16, a matchup between these two teams to see who could advance to the NFL playoffs and who's going to win the NFC South potentially. Now, of course, Chuba Hubbard has had himself a fair share of opportunities over the course of the last 4 weeks now. Now, prior to this recent stretch of success, back in Week 7, the week that Christian McCaffrey was traded to the San Francisco 49ers, Chuba Hubbard came out and took majority of the touches up against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, in which he had 9 carries for 63 overall rushing yards, a rushing touchdown, 3 targets, 2 catches, 10 yards, and 14.3 fantasy points in 3 quarters of play against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. For those of you who remember, the Carolina Panthers beat the Buccaneers earlier this season and actually held them to 3 offensive points, which is ridiculous. Now, that's certainly going to give us more confidence in the potential of Chuba Hubbard, especially considering from weeks 12 through 16, after coming back from his injury, he's been averaging 12 rushing attempts per game, 69 rushing yards per game, 0.25 rushing touchdowns, and of course, 1.5 targets, 1.5 receptions, 21 receiving yards, 11.15 half PPR fantasy points. Pretty good overall numbers. Now, even with that being the case, D'Onta Foreman is by far and away the number one running back in this backfield. Even yesterday in the game, D'Onta Foreman, 21 rushing attempts in comparison to Chuba Hubbard's 12. Yet, Chuba Hubbard played 46% of the offensive snaps, while D'Onta Foreman played the other 44%. So they're splitting the backfield, and with those opportunities going in the direction of Chuba Hubbard, of course, he's still of value for those of you who need a running back to go ahead and fill up your roster. Not only that, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, they've had a lot of injuries via their defense. We just saw James Conner run through them. There's a good chance that Chuba Hubbard could follow as suit and do the same. Moving on to Gus Edwards, our number 2. We've mentioned Gus Edwards and, of course, talked a lot about J.K. Dobbins as late, considering his recent success over the course of the last 3 weeks, from weeks 14 through 16. Now, while J.K. Dobbins was having himself those 100-plus yard games, we saw, of course, Gus Edwards was getting his opportunity and currently only rostered in 41% of leagues, is coming off of 3 weeks in which he had 31 rushing attempts, 220 rushing yards, and no touchdowns, which is 22 fantasy points. Not great, but it's a 7.09 yard per carry average. This upcoming week, they do take on the Pittsburgh Steelers. And the reason why we want to focus on Gus Edwards is the fact that J.K. Dobbins, again, like I mentioned in other circumstances, he's not 100% healthy. I mean, even going back to this last week, did not practice a single time during the week, was on the NIR, which is non-injury related, but they attributed it to his knee. Therefore, they just wanted to rest him just to go ahead and make sure that he was ready for Sunday, healthy, ready to go, and they didn't put too many miles on his legs. That being said, if they're going to continue to lean in the direction of giving Gus Edwards more and more rushing attempts, coming off of a game of 11 carries for 99 rushing yards, going up against the Pittsburgh Steelers, which a couple weeks ago, J.K. Dobbins, 15 carries, 120 and a touchdown. Gus Edwards in that same game, 13 carries for 66 rushing yards. If Gus Edwards gets a little bit more of a uptick of opportunity, potentially finds himself in a goal line scenario, could be a fantastic play up against Pittsburgh. Moving on to the final option at the running back position, we mentioned Royce Freeman. Since the absence and or injury that took place with Dameon Pierce that landed him on the injured reserve, many of us assumed that it was going to be either Rex Burkhead or Derek Gumbawale. For the last 2 weeks, we have seen Royce Freeman, the former Denver and Carolina running back, attribute himself to 27 rushing attempts for 83 rushing yards, 2 targets and 2 receptions, 11 receiving yards. So a total of 94 total yards in the last 2 weeks and 10.4 fantasy points. They do take on the Jacksonville Jaguars. Again, this is a desperate times lead to desperate measures kind of overall pick up and play, if in fact you need it and you're playing in a deeper league, because outside of a guy by the name of Dameon Pierce or Arian Foster, I'm not starting any other Houston Texans running backs in my lineups. And I know Arian Foster is like 10 years retired. Okay. So that being said, this is a scenario where Royce Freeman is currently rostered in quite literally 0% of leagues on Yahoo. I'm sure he's got himself some sort of percentage, but it's less than 1%, and rightfully so, because we really can't trust the matchup, especially based on how well the Jacksonville Jaguars have played defensively over the course of the last month. Therefore, he is a desperate measure running back for your circumstance. All right, let's go ahead and move on. Let's begin talking about wide receivers. In the same circumstance in which we talked about Tyler Allgeier and James Cook as players that should have already been rostered, I also want to mention DJ Chark and Brandin Cooks in that same vein, mainly because these are both wide receivers that are rostered in 51% and 54% of leagues, both of them coming off of incredible weeks. But of course, DJ Chark for the course of the last month has been a relevant fantasy wide receiver and is playing extremely well within that offense. Brandin Cooks just came off injury, and we knew that because of his relationship with Davis Mills, he was going to find success. He was able to be a pretty solid top 36 wide receiver, to say the very least. Now, when we go ahead and just talk about players with higher range of availability, we begin with the thumbnail of today's video, Jahan Dotson, the rookie wide receiver, former first-round pick, absolutely crushing it in terms of fantasy. In the last 3 games, 13.9, 18.5, 16.6 half PPR fantasy points, a minimum of a single touchdown in each of those last 3 games, and has gotten himself 9, 6, and 9 targets. We're probably going to see a transition from Taylor Heinicke to Carson Wentz, and that only helps Jahan Dotson because in the games he has played with a starting Carson Wentz earlier this season prior to his injury, the guy was a touchdown machine nonetheless, even in those circumstances. So the quarterback switch does not impede on his potential. I think he's a fantastic play going forward and potentially top 36 once again in the given week. Moving on to Richie James Jr. Now, Richie James is in a position within this offense that he's the primary slot receiver. Going up against the Indianapolis Colts in week 17, considering Kenny Moore, the primary nickel for that defense, is most likely going to miss another couple weeks here, we're in a situation where Richie James has shown enough consistency, and he's currently only rostered in 17% of leagues. I'm thinking to myself, the fact that Richie James has had 4 performances in the last 6 games of 12 or more fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format, those performances consisting of 12.3, 12.6, 15.6, and 13.0 just this last week with 12 targets, 8 catches, 90 yards against the Minnesota Vikings secondary. I think he's a fantastic pickup and play potentially here. Moving on to the final option I wanted to mention before we get into the rest of the wide receiver conversation on the next panel, we have Greg Dortch. Greg Dortch was the only relevant wide receiver within that offense. DeAndre Hopkins had 10 targets last night for 1 total reception and 4 yards. Now, if you guys remember a couple weeks back with Rondale Moore going down with an injury, I was pretty poised to expect Greg Dortch to have himself a big performance. Unfortunately, a couple weeks back did not have that great game up against the New England Patriots, and now just recently has gotten back into the mix. 11 targets, 10 catches, 98 yards. Quite literally is the only option within that offense, considering Trace McSorley's inaccuracy at the quarterback position, that can be deemed of value going forward within this given week. All right, let's move on to the second half of the wide receiver conversation. Beginning with our number 4, we have Romeo Doubs. Romeo Doubs could have himself incredible value, primarily because, number 1, they do take on the Minnesota Vikings. They are one of the worst secondaries in the National Football League. We just saw, a guy like Richie James Jr., like we previously mentioned. We saw Darius Slayton and Isaiah Hodgins, who we'll go ahead and mention in just a moment, all have themselves incredible weeks with Daniel Jones just on Saturday against his secondary. So why not someone like Romeo Doubs, especially considering Christian Watson did not participate in the second half of that Miami game yesterday due to a hip flexor injury that held him out. If that is going to continue to play as a factor and potentially keep Christian Watson from being active, I expect Romeo Doubs to potentially be a fantastic play in this given week. Let's move on to Isaiah Hodgins. Like I just mentioned, he's coming off of an incredible performance of 18.9 fantasy points against the Minnesota Vikings defense. Now he has an opportunity in week 17 of taking on the Indianapolis Colts. In 3 out of the last 4 weeks, Isaiah Hodgins has put up 12 or more half PPR fantasy points. He's on the same overall kind of pace as Richie James. This overall wide receiver core has had themselves a lot of potential over the course of last week's. Even though they're not big name guys, they're playing extremely well. And in a situation where the Giants, of course, are trying to continue to make the playoffs, and if in fact they win one of these next 2 games, they're going to be able to do so. Going up against Indianapolis seems like an opportunity for them to step up and make big plays. Let's move on to Hunter Renfrow, or number 6. Hunter Renfrow has only played 43% and 47% of the offensive snaps in the last 2 games. Yet he did come down with an overall touchdown. And if you guys remember in 2021, Hunter Renfrow and touchdowns were pretty much on a per week basis ever since, Darren Waller went down with an injury midway through the 2021 year. But if in fact we can get Hunter Renfrow more utilization, more opportunity within this offense, when they get down into the red zone, that is where he cooks. That is where his route running ability and the inability for defenders to go ahead and cover him really gets to go ahead and be exploited. I'm expecting Hunter Renfrow going up against the San Francisco 49ers in a matchup in which they're going to have to throw for the entirety of the game to see him find himself a lot of success. Let's move on to number 7. We have Kendrick Bourne. Kendrick Bourne could end up having a little bit lesser of a week if, in fact, we do see Devontae Parker return from concussion protocol. We know Devontae Parker going up against the Miami Dolphins will be a fantastic another revenge game for him. He played well in week 1 against them. There's a potential in which Kendrick Bourne could be great, but it's going to have to be with the absence of Devontae Parker from the lineup. Let's move on to Dante Pettis, or number 8. They do take on the Detroit Lions. The fact of the matter is the Detroit Lions are one of the worst secondaries in the National Football League. We have to take advantage of it, to say the very least. Not only that, with Chase Claypool missing time and Dante Pettis primarily playing in the slot position, he could be a value, score another touchdown potentially this week. Moving on to Rashid Shaheed. If in fact we do end up seeing Chris Olave miss another consecutive week, considering we already know that Jarvis Landry is on the injured reserve, there really isn't anyone else to target within this offense. Primarily led the receiving position of the New Orleans Saints on Saturday against the Cleveland Browns. So if in fact opportunity strikes once again, could be a value going up against the Philadelphia Eagles secondary. All right, let's go ahead and let's move on. Let's talk about some quarterbacks and tight ends. Beginning with our quarterback 1, it is Gardner Minshew. I'm glad I trusted Gardner Minshew as much as I did. I knew that the talent was going to prevail. And like I mentioned throughout the week, one of the best backup quarterbacks in the National Football League, to say the least, and that obviously proved itself. Now, the team that surrounds him obviously elevates him to that level, but you got to remember, like I mentioned last week, in 11 of the last 13 games that Gardner Minshew has played, he has had 2 or more touchdowns scored. In 4 of those last 11 games, 3 or more touchdowns scored. Gardner Minshew has played extremely well, coming off of a week of 22.7 fantasy points. He takes on the New Orleans Saints. Again, with the elite team that surrounds him, I'm expecting another week of success, especially considering there's an idea that Jalen Hurts does not play in the given week. Moving on, let's talk about Brock Purdy. Brock Purdy, another consecutive week of consistency. The last 4 performances, 15.96, 16.48, 21.7, and 14.3. That 14.3 point performance, of course, is when he came in to take over for Jimmy Garoppolo. Otherwise, he's 15.5 or more fantasy points for the quarterback position. He does take on the Las Vegas Raiders defense. They've given up the 6th most passing yards amongst all teams in the National Football League thus far. I'm expecting that to be an automatic play, currently only rostered in 36% of leagues. Hopefully available for those of you who are in desperate need of a quarterback. Moving on to Mike White. Again, Mike White should be available, only rostered in 17% of leagues. It has been confirmed by Robert Saleh, the head coach of the New York Jets, that Mike White will be returning to the starting quarterback position, as they will inactivate. Of course, Zach Wilson has the yips. I don't know what he has, but it's just a mess. When we get Mike White back into the quarterback position, all of the components that surround him within this offense, whether it's rushing, whether it's receiving, are going to have a huge uptick in terms of potential. So for those of you who have the likes of Zonovan Knight and or Garrett Wilson, Elijah Moore, Corey Davis, Tyler Conklin potentially, like we'll mention in a bit, they could be fantastic plays, especially considering they do take on the Seattle Seahawks. The only other quarterback that I wanted to mention as a potential honorable mention is Carson Wentz. He did end up taking over for Taylor Heineke, went 12 for 16 passing, 123 yards and a passing touchdown, 8.9 fantasy points in just a little bit of time, to be totally honest. If in fact they make a full transition to Carson Wentz against the Cleveland Browns, could have himself a big game here. You got to remember, in the 6 games that Carson Wentz played as a starting quarterback of this team, 3 of those games, less than 10 fantasy points. 3 of those games, more than 20 fantasy points. Very volatile, but again, for those of you who are in desperate need of quarterback. Moving on, let's talk about tight ends, beginning with our number one, Noah Fant. Noah Fant is currently rostered in 24% of leagues, back-to-back weeks of a scoring touchdown down in the red zone. If we find himself in the end zone again, could be another top 12 player within the given week. Again, I don't really trust it, but it depends. Moving on, let's talk about Tyler Conklin. Again, with Mike White returning, like we previously mentioned, there is going to be value for the receiving threats within this offense. They do take on the Seattle Seahawks. The Seattle Seahawks have not played well against opposing tight ends all season long. Tyler Conklin could be a pretty big play here in the given week. Moving on to the final option here that we wanted to mention is Logan Thomas. Again, with Carson Wentz returning to the lineup, it could give him more and more potential for value. The fact of the matter is, coming off a week of 8 targets, it is very unlikely to see him get a high volume of targets in that same scenario, but you never know. We may see this team transition to far more 11 personnel going forward. The only other tight end that I wanted to mention that many of you may be wondering, Andrew, why is Shane Zylstra not here? It's mainly because Shane Zylstra has pretty much not been relevant all season long. He's continued to play the exact same amount of snaps over the course of the last month, and all of a sudden he shows up and has 5 catches, 3 receiving touchdowns, and 26 yards. I think it's a little too volatile for someone like me to suggest to you to play him in your fantasy championship game when everything is on the line and it's win or go home. All right, moving on. Let's talk about kickers and defenses. I love to see Eddie Pinheiro have another huge week. Eddie Pinheiro at the kicker position, the last 4 consecutive weeks have consisted of 12, 13, 12, and 14 fantasy points. Why is he only rostered in 2% of leagues? Wake up, people. He is winning fantasy championships for my teams. He should be doing so for yours. Moving on to our number 2, we have Riley Patterson. Riley Patterson for the last 3 weeks, 13, 11, 15, winning fantasy championships because he's only 2% rostered. Why isn't he on your roster yet? Moving on, we have Matt Prater, who over the course of the last 2 weeks has had 14 fantasy points each game, 9% rostered, could be a value. Again, when we progress throughout the week, weather is certainly going to make a huge difference. So if in fact your stud kicker is in a scenario where the wind is far too crazy, the weather is going to be an impact, you might want to position yourself to play one of these potential overall kickers because they may be in a better overall position for this given week, especially Eddie Pinheiro playing in Tampa Bay. The weather should not be an issue in that game. Moving on, let's talk about defenses. Continuing on with another factor within the Jacksonville Jaguars roster, we have their overall defense, considering they have scored 12, 12, and 14 fantasy points in the last 3 consecutive games, only rostered in 18% of leagues. They take on the Houston Texans. Must play, must pick up, maybe my number 1 waiver wire pickup of the week. Moving on to our number 2, we have the Carolina Panthers. It's just interesting how we have both the kicker and defenses of the Panthers and the Jaguars, both cat teams that are ending up actually playing well as of late, and potentially maybe even getting themselves into playoff contention. Either way, the Carolina Panthers, they do take on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, like I mentioned earlier with Chuba Hubbard. The fact of the matter is, the last time the Carolina Panthers took on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, they held them to 3 points. Could be very similar this upcoming week. Moving on to the final option, it is the Los Angeles Rams. If the Rams want to show up in that sort of capacity once again, identical to the way in which they just exploded the entire Denver Broncos organization, not only do we have offensive linemen fighting backup quarterbacks, we also had the head coach get fired this morning of the Denver Broncos. If that Rams defense shows up once again, could be a value this upcoming week. All right, that's going to pretty much cover it in terms of waiver wire targets. I wanted to go ahead and cover some PrizePick entries going into tonight's Monday Night Football game before we conclude today's episode. So let's go ahead and check that out right now. All right, so as you guys can see to the right of me, we are here via PrizePicks. Again, if you guys haven't checked them out, there's a link down in the description. Use promo code Andrew today when you sign up and make that first-time deposit, because your first-time deposit is immediately doubled up to $100. Go ahead and check that out. So tonight, the 2 best plays that I have found in my mind that give you guys a chance of having a player on each side of the ball, because again, you need to have one player on each side, or at least from 2 different organizations, whether it's the NBA, whether it's the NFL, NHL, all that kind of jazz. But in terms of Monday Night Football in specific, I really do like the potential in terms of going after Keenan Allen, going more on his overall receiving yard total of 60.5. Again, if we go ahead and look at these numbers, he's been able to surpass this in 4 out of the last 5 games, of course, finding himself a lot of success. Like I mentioned, the last 3 weeks of overall targets, 37 in the direction of Keenan Allen. If we continue to see high volume of targets go in his direction, that receiving yard total should be at a base minimum of 61 receiving yards. So I'm taking more on that number. Now, the other player that I liked in terms of the overall, talking about the Indianapolis side of the ball, because again, you need to have an Indianapolis player to go ahead and put together an entry, is fantasy score in the regard of Chase McLaughlin. Chase McLaughlin, the kicker. Again, if you just go ahead and look at how many fantasy points he's put up in the last couple of weeks, we mentioned him as a waiver wire target last week for a reason. He's been able to meet 7 or go more in each of the last 5 weeks. We're in an absolute fantastic position here. I'm going to go ahead and put in an entry with these two players. And then if in fact I wanted to go ahead and add more to it, potentially talking about like Austin Eckler going more on his overall receptions, or Justin Herbert scoring more than 18.5 fantasy points, anything of that nature, I would go ahead and make a separate slip. But we'll go ahead, put in an entry for this on the given week, and pretty much close it at that. If you guys want to go ahead and check them out, be sure to go ahead and do so. There's a link down in the description. Be sure to use promo code Andrew. Tomorrow, we'll be talking about running back rankings for week 17 of the fantasy football season. Again, congratulations for making it thus far. Tonight, we will not be live streaming. So for those of you who are wondering, we all have a lot on the line going into this week. So I want to go ahead, make sure I prepare for everything, get all that settled for this week's videos. So everybody, thank you for watching. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.